Hello, and welcome to this, our first Q&A on Indigenous History Now. Just a little bit of info. This is a re-recording of a video I posted about 6 months ago. I solicited some Q&As from you guys. Some of them I was pretty familiar with, some of them I wasn't, and I had to do a little bit of research on to answer the questions. And admittedly, there was one question where I didn't do as much research as I should have. And so I had my answer and I put that out there on the internet. And then the nightmare of every history YouTube creator happened. And about 2 weeks after I posted that, I found some more information on another history YouTuber's channel that didn't contradict anything that I had said. It just added more context that I felt mine was severely lacking in. And so I didn't feel comfortable having that out on the internet without that context. So I pulled the video with the intention of remaking it and reposting it. And 6 months later, here we are. And I figured that there were a couple of other questions in that video where my response was just kind of long and rambly, and I figured it could be a little more concise. So I re-recorded most of it, but there are some snippets you'll see from the original video. So this is going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge. All right, let's get hopping into it. If you have any questions about any topic in Indigenous American cultures and histories, from ancient culture to colonial to modern or current events, leave it down in the comments and we'll address those in future videos. So the first question that I wanted to talk about is my background. I've gotten this question a couple times. When I started the channel, I wasn't very open about it. I was a little bit concerned about, online privacy and stuff like that. I was hemming and hawing about how open I wanted to be about personal details, but I've shown my face a couple times, and I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with sharing more. So I thought I'd share a little bit more about why do I talk about the topics that I do. Why does this channel exist? I am non-native. I grew up in mostly upper Minnesota and southwestern Wyoming, though I've lived in a bunch of other places as well. And I went through my upbringing and my public school education learning what knowing better would describe as the standard American history myth. Indigenous people existed, and then the white man came and real history started, and we were freedom lovers, so we said screw the British, and we had some problems like slavery that was maybe a bit yucky, but we fixed slavery in the 1860s, and maybe we had a little bit of racism and sexism, but we fixed that in the 1970s, and America's great, and the worst day in America is better than the best day anywhere else, and we're all happy and lucky to be alive people, and nothing's wrong nowadays. If you've gone through the American education system, you'll probably recognize, you at the beginning of your history, at the beginning of the year for every year, you kind of have the token chapter on Indigenous people, where you could learn everything you could possibly need to know about multiple ethnic groups across an entire continent and 10,000 years of history in one chapter. And then we close the book on that, and the white people arrive, and the real history starts. And, coincidentally, Indigenous people just kind of stopped getting mentioned after the year 1900. And I had always really been into history. I knew I wanted to do something in the history sphere when I grew up. I was a voracious consumer of the History Channel as a 7-year-old. And it did always stick in the back of my mind that, it'd be nice if we learned a little bit more about Indigenous people. But I always figured that would happen next year. Oh, next year we'll learn more. Oh, next year we'll learn more. And next year kept coming and coming. And come senior year in high school, and surprise, surprise, it didn't happen. Anecdotally, towards the end of my junior year in high school, I had taken AP US History, and we're 2 months out from the end of the school year, and an article gets published, which is co-signed by 50 of America's leading historians from the top schools like Harvard and Yale and Stanford and such, criticizing the textbook that my school had used for AP US History, so the textbook that I had been learning from, as whitewashing American history. So that was the rigor of the history education I got in public school. So by the time I'm getting close to the end of high school, I knew I wanted to go to college and probably be a history professor, maybe teacher, but leaning more towards professor. And I knew that I wanted to specialize in American history, and that there was a large segment of American history where my knowledge was lacking, and that was Indigenous American history. Then there were also 2 more influences that weighed on me in high school. first of all, I was a member of the Boy Scouts of America, and there's a sub-organization within the BSA called the Order of the Arrow. And the Order of the Arrow does use Indigenous symbolism in a lot of the things that OA does. We would wear Indigenous-inspired regalia in some of the ceremonies we did. Now, there's a very valid criticism to be had about cultural appropriation of Indigenous people, about playing Indian in the BSA and the OA specifically. I have heard horror stories from your regional segment of the OA is called a lodge. I've heard horror stories from lodges across the nation being extremely disrespectful in their use of this Indigenous symbology. There's a valid criticism to be had about that being appropriative. And I think, I haven't been active in the last couple of years, I think the BSA is kind of starting to have that conversation now better than they have in the past. I was lucky in my local lodge in Seattle that we recognized some of the problematic tendencies with a mostly white organization appropriating Native culture like this. And we did our best to have relations with local Indigenous people and learn from them and try to be as respectful as possible in what we were doing. And for this use of Native culture in the program to be a teaching tool to the people in the program, not just like a backdrop. We had personal relationships with a Makah elder and his family, I believe with a Haida elder and his family. We had with a Lummi and a Snohomish elder and their families. And I did learn more about Indigenous peoples, specifically Pacific Northwest Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures. And I was exposed to more about Indigenous cultures from Indigenous people than I had ever been in my whole public school education. And that's a problem. And then another thing that happened towards the end of sometimes in junior or senior year is I watched a documentary about Ken Burns. Love Ken Burns, love his stuff, called The West, which was obviously about the history of the Western United States, the concept of the West, the settlement of the West. And it wasn't that documentary centered Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous experiences of the American colonization of the West. There was definitely a lot of focus on the settler side of things, but it focused on Indigenous history, Indigenous interactions with Western colonizers, Indigenous pre-contact histories, Indigenous experiences, way more than I had ever been presented in school. And, when I heard the article about my textbook being a whitewashed textbook, I didn't really understand what they were talking about, because that's how whitewashing and historical revisionism works, right? You are presented a selected and propagandized view of history, and you don't know what you don't know unless you're presented with more information, unless you are exposed to things that you didn't learn about in this propagandized education. You don't know that it's being whitewashed. And so when I saw this documentary and learned a bunch of stuff that we didn't talk about in school, I was like, oh, that's what they mean. And so the knowledge that there was a huge, big, gaping black hole in my understanding of American history that was just an empty void was really crystallized from that. So when I went to college, I went explicitly to get a history and American Indian Studies degree, to specialize in American history and to learn everything I should have learned about Indigenous history before I graduated high school. And I learned more in my first quarter in college about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous history than I had in my entire public school education. Eventually, I had always been interested in language and with learning new languages. I got involved learning Lushootseed, which is the language of the Puget Sound area where I live, and dabbled a little bit in Clallam, which is a neighboring Salish language. And for personal reasons, my partner is Native Hawaiian. I started learning Hawaiian. And I had always been interested in languages, but always, gone towards the history side because I thought that's where the jobs were. But over the course of college, that language side really started coming up more, and I embraced that. So I switched the history degree out for a linguistics degree and graduated with an AIS in linguistics degrees. And in my college, the department was called American Indian Studies, so the degree is in American Indian Studies. And now I'm really interested in Indigenous language revitalization. But I also am still interested in history, and so this is where the channel comes from, because I definitely think that I should not have had to go $16,000 in student debt to learn what I learned about the deep history of this continent and the people who have populated this continent for more than just 400 years. So that's what the point of this channel is basically taking what I learned in my AIS degree and making it freely accessible to everyone in the public. Obviously, my primary target audience are my fellow North Americans, other people from the US and Canada, because you guys have a similar history to us, but also, if we in North America are not learning a whole lot about Indigenous North America, I know a good portion of my audience does not live in North America. I can only imagine you guys are learning next to nothing about this continent, about the pre-colonial history of this continent as well. And for that matter, a bunch about the, indigenous side of the colonial history of this continent as well. I do my best to try to center Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous experiences, to center Indigenous knowledge, and to critically deconstruct and disentangle and analyze the colonial narratives that, if you grew up in the US or Canada, you've been propagandized with your entire life. Towards that end, I always love hearing from Indigenous viewers. I really appreciate you guys' feedback about what I am doing well, what I am doing poorly, what I can improve on. I would love to feature more prominently Indigenous voices in the videos and in the creation of these videos. I would love to get to the point with this channel where I can travel and visit communities and interview people, interview elders, knowledge holders, tribal officials, native academics, activists, just anybody. So if you are one of my Indigenous viewers and you are interested in helping me and helping this channel center that Indigenous knowledge, if you guys know of any resources you can suggest, or if you want to help me out doing research at any point in time, I would love to hear from you guys, either in the comments or you can shoot me an email, indigenoushistorynow@gmail.com. I'll link it down in the description. It's also on my About tab. I would love to prominently feature Indigenous people in a channel that talks about Indigenous people. Seems only right. Okay, so that's about me, about my background. Let's get to the first question. The first question is, I've always wondered about common threads in the legends and myths of the North American indigenous peoples. Is it possible to trace the migrations of people using their mythologies? It would be interesting to see where the common threads occur. Yes and no. There are some instances where common threads in mythologies and literary traditions do parallel with routes of migration. One example of this is Polynesia. Obviously, this isn't North America, but stick with me. If you look at the creation stories of Hawaiians, Tahitians, and Maori in Aotearoa in New Zealand, they're all very similar. And if you compare these with the creation stories of Tongans, the Tongan creation stories are very different. So just from the mythology, you can possibly postulate that there is a closer cultural connection between Aotearoa, Tahiti, and Hawaii than there is between either of those three and Tonga. And if we look at linguistic evidence, it backs this up. Hawaiian, Tahitian, and Maori are all considered Eastern Polynesian languages, whereas Tonga is considered a Tongic language. This is a separate language branch of the Polynesian language family. Now here's the thing. Tonga is closer to Aotearoa than Tahiti is to Aotearoa. Tahiti is a couple thousand miles to the northeast, and Tonga is a little bit to the northeast, but much closer. So it looks like people migrated from Tonga to Tahiti, then from Tahiti to Aotearoa, rather than going straight from Tonga to Aotearoa. And the linguistic and the archaeological evidence back that up. So there in Polynesia, we have an instance of shared connections through mythology, parallel with connections through linguistics and with routes of migration. However, if we look at, say, in North America, I talked about in my creation myths video the earth diver archetype, which is very prevalent among Algonquian and Iroquoian speakers of the eastern woodlands. Now, in Pacific Northwest mythology, it doesn't tend to be in creation myths, but there are very strong parallels and elements of this earth diver literary archetype. However, there's no strong linguistic connection between these two regions. You have Algonquian and Iroquoian languages in the eastern woodlands, and you have Salishan, Wakashan, Athabascan, and lots of language isolates over in the Pacific Northwest. And archaeologically and genetically as well, there's no one out there saying that there was a direct migration from the Pacific Northwest coast region straight across to the eastern woodlands. So here we have similarities in the mythologies that don't seem to be paralleling with a close connection between these two ethnic groups that could correspond to a route of migration. We do know there are trade routes between these two regions, though. There are trade routes throughout all of the North American continent, but including connecting the Pacific Northwest with the Far East. And myths and legends tend to spread very easily along trade routes. Myths and legends tend to be correlated with religions, and religions, we know, can spread very easily across ethnic boundaries without there having to be a connection of descent between two ethnic groups. Religions also travel very quickly across trade routes. So, of all the evidence you could use to try to establish relations of descent and migration between two people groups, I would use mythology as one data point among many, and I would use it pretty low down on the list just because of how easily it can jump across ethnic boundaries. I would put a lot more stock in language. Now, language can also jump across ethnic boundaries. Just because two people speak the same language does not mean they are from ethnic groups that are related in any way. But in order for one ethnic group to adopt the language of another ethnic group, that attests to a long period of time of close and intimate contact. Just because learning another language is hard, it takes a long time. For a whole people group to learn another language is hard, it takes a long time. To adopt somebody else's religion or to use aspects from their stories, those have a much lower hurdle to enter than learning somebody else's language. So you can use myths as one data point among many. When you're trying to establish connections between different ethnic groups, I would put a lot more weight on language. Next question. As someone who studies native languages, what are your thoughts on the proposed Dene-Yeniseian language family, and what is the scholarly consensus on it? Is there any basis in this theory? Do you know of any other proposed language families in the Americas? There's pretty strong basis for this theory. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Na-Dene is a language family in North America, present in the American Southwest and in northwestern Canada. And the Yeniseian languages are a language family along the Yenisei River in Siberia. And there is a proposal to lump these two together as a single language family of Dene-Yeniseian. And there's a lot of good evidence for that. Connections were noticed all the way back in the 1920s, but a lot of research has been put forth within the last 20 years out of Western Washington University, primarily by a linguist by the name of, I think, Edward Vida is his name. And he was able to reconstruct proto-languages that connect these two language families. He was able to trace common phonological changes, common tone changes between them, but he also looked at syntax and morphology as well, and noticed that Yeniseian languages use a lot of verbal prefixing. Now, heavy verbal prefixing is not uncommon in North America, not uncommon in the Dene languages. It's very rare in Eurasia. East Asian languages don't tend to have a lot of inflection at all, and West Eurasian and Siberian languages tend to be heavily suffixing, not prefixing. So, other than the Yeniseian languages, the next closest languages that are heavily prefixing are the Dene languages in northwestern Canada. He has also looked beyond linguistic evidence to genetic evidence, and there is a haplogroup that is present in every Indigenous American, can't remember it off the top of my head, I'll put it up here, that is present in 90% of Yeniseians, and present in pretty much no other Eurasian people group. There's only one other Eurasian people group where it's present in a high degree other than the Yeniseians, and that is the Selkups, who have been intermarrying with the Yeniseians for generations. Now, the scholarly consensus is cautiously optimistic. The attitude is, it looks good, let's do more research. And part of the reason for this hesitancy is because there is a bit of controversy in the linguistic community regarding uber macro language families like this that cover vast geographic distances between their members. And that is because there have been some linguists who have been a little overzealous and fast and loose with the evidence to try to argue for uber macro families like this. One famous example is with the Altaic languages. It's widely recognized that Japanese is a language isolate. It does not fit in with any other language family. Well, several years ago, there was an attempt to classify Japanese with Korean, with some Turkic and Mongolic languages into a Uber language family of Altaic. Now, the problem was the linguists arguing for the Altaic language family were getting confused between hereditary linguistics and areal linguistics. If you see common features between two languages, there are two ways that those features could have come about. One is through descent. Maybe these two languages are related to one another, they have a common ancestor. For example, French and Spanish are both Romance languages. They both descend from a common ancestor of Latin. Going one step further, Latin and German come from a common ancestor. They are both part of the Indo-European language family. So we can trace that these languages descend to each other from common ancestors. But then there's another way that you can swap features, and that is through just geographical proximity. If speakers from two different languages are commonly coming across one another, that close contact between those two languages is eventually going to swap features. It can swap sounds, it can swap syntactic structures, it can swap morphemes and grammatical features, it can swap tones. One example of this is the English word algebra comes from Arabic. And we have lots of words in English that come from Arabic. But English is an Indo-European language, and Arabic is an Afro-Asiatic language. They do not share a common ancestor. So it is from the contact between Arabic and English speakers that we swapped some vocabulary. And that's what was going on with Altaic. These linguists were trying to argue that Altaic was a hereditary language family, a precursor to Mongolic and Turkic and Korean and Japanese languages, when in reality it was a case of areal linguistics. Because these languages and their speakers were close to one another and had contact with each other, they were sharing features. So blunders like this have earned a derogatory title for people who want to try to argue for big macro language families like this as lumpers. Lumpers are widely seen as overzealous, as not always very discriminating in their interpretation of their data. And to be honest, there are some cases of lumperism that Altaic is kind of an honest mistake. It's being a little bit careless with the data, but one could see how a professional linguist could kind of be fooled into thinking that Altaic is a hereditary family, not an areal linguistics phenomenon. There are other lumperist families that are just in the realm of conspiracy theory. That's how far out there they are. And so this hesitancy towards being branded a lumper has led some to go way too far in the other direction and be extremely, extremely discriminating in their highlighting differences between languages into a group called the splitters. And the splitters are kind of derogatorily known for ripping apart language families that have good evidence to be classified as together. So, taking this to the case of Dene-Yeniseian, most of the linguistic community is cautiously optimistic, but they don't want to be too eager about it because proposals of macro groupings like this, because of this lumper-splitter conflict, can really quickly get bogged down and ideological and focused more on whether someone is known as a lumper or a splitter than the actual data. So that's why most linguists are pumping the brakes a little, but they are cautiously optimistic. Like I said, they're in the camp of, looks good, let's do more research. There is a proposal, a macro level proposal above Dene-Yeniseian that includes Dene-Yeniseian as part of a larger family. I believe they're calling it the Caucasian language family, which includes Dene-Yeniseian, Sino-Tibetan, some Caucasian languages, and Basque from the Pyrenees. And that is pretty resoundingly derided as false amongst the academic community. But Dene-Yeniseian itself looks pretty good. As far as other proposed macro language families in the Americas, the first that comes to my mind is Penutian, which is a proposed macro family of Tsimshianic languages in central coastal British Columbia, Plateau languages in eastern Oregon and Washington, Wintuan and Maiduan languages from central California. And currently those are all considered separate language families. and the proposed Penutian family would classify them all together as one. That's the only one that comes to my mind. I might do a little bit of digging and put some others down in the description, but Penutian is the only one that I can think of. Next question. Would you shed some light on Africans sailing here before Columbus? Apparently there are Americans claiming Africans showed the Aztecs and Mayans how to build structures. Also, do you believe the Olmecs were of African descent? No, I do not believe the Olmecs were of African descent. In the first iteration of this video, I answered this question. I'm going to hold off on that for now, actually, because in the not too distant future, I am going to be revising and republishing my land bridge series, mostly for, audio quality, but also there's some new information that I want to put in there as well. And I am going to talk extensively about this question in that video. So I'll save that for then, something you can look forward to if you're seeing this video when it first comes out. What I will say is this. There is very, very, very little evidence. I would almost go so far as to say no evidence for any level of sustained or significant contact between Africa and the Americas prior to contact with Columbus. And absolutely, positively, unequivocally, nobody, not Africans, not white people, not anybody else, taught indigenous Americans how to build structures, how to build cities, how to form societies, how to farm, how to hunt, how to be people. Unequivocally, indigenous Americans figured all that stuff out on their own. I'll talk more about this question at a later time. I did want to include it here, though, just to say that I noticed this question. This is one of the most commented questions I have gotten in my comment section, which kind of surprised me. So I wanted to include it as part of this video just to say I acknowledge this question. I will be addressing it in more detail later. Now to maybe a slightly less controversial, but still controversial question. The Cerutti Mastodon site looks likely to push back human habitation in the Americas 130,000 years. So far back, it might not even be Homo sapiens. Any thoughts on this and any speculation you'd like to make, educated or otherwise, on what other human species it could be? Well, I'm not going to make any speculation on what other human species it could be. Sorry about that. I am not educated enough in early human anthropology to be able to make an informed decision on that. For those of you who don't know, the Cerutti Mastodon site was a site that was discovered, I think, in the 90s in San Diego. It was discovered by accident. It was a construction site, and a backhoe operator or something like that found some bones. And when you find bones on a construction site, everything stops. And so they brought in an anthropologist or an archaeologist because these weren't human bones, and they looked at it and they found a mastodon skeleton. They found a bunch of other skeletons, but the interesting one was a mastodon skeleton. It was disarticulated, meaning that it wasn't a complete in-place skeleton. It was kind of a jumbled mess. And the interesting thing about it was they were jumbled together in a very interesting way, almost like they had been brought together in kind of a pile, not necessarily a pile, but almost like they had been brought together. Some of the bones were actually standing straight up through several layers of soil. You also had stones which looked like they had been used as hammering instruments. And there was evidence of, for example, isotopes on one side of the stone matched the isotopes on the bone. So looking like one side of the stone had made contact with a bone, kind of like a hammer would. There were flaked off shards from the stones. I can't remember the official archaeological term for this, but that they matched perfectly with the stone. So you have the mother stone and its flaked off shard next to each other in the same site. And what's interesting about all of this is this was all in a layer of silt. Now, I myself am not a soil expert. I will link a video right here and down in the description to another channel who did a great summary on the Cerutti Mastodon site. He'll go into a lot more detail than I will. This will be a very rough summary. But essentially, the type of soil this site was in is not a type of soil where you would see big rocks like this. Not unless there had been some other invasion from another layer. There did not seem to be any invasion. It seemed to be undisturbed stratigraphy. And what's more, so the thing about these silt layers is they don't have enough energy to transport these kinds of big rocks. But if they did have enough energy to transport this big rock, why did they not have the energy to wash away and carry away the little tiny fragment shards that came off of these rocks. That looked like these rocks were introduced into these layers from some other force, not from natural geological processes. So we have disarticulated mastodon bones that are broken. We have rocks that look like they could have been used as hammers in a layer of soil which really doesn't explain the presence of those rocks. And then you have the bone that was sticking straight up through several layers of soil, and very few natural geological processes could make something like that happen. So this was a very intriguing looking site. And then they looked at the dates. And they didn't date it with radiocarbon dating, they dated it with some sort of uranium method originally. And they came up with 130,000 years. And this rocked them to their core, because up until the point where they got the dates, they were really starting to think that this was a human mastodon kill site, because everything just looks wrong about it being natural. And then they got those dates. Now, the thing about 130,000 years, number one, at the time that this was discovered, Clovis first was still the dominant theory, and I have done 2 videos already talking about Clovis first ad nauseum, so you can go look back at those. But anyway, this would push back the accepted date of human habitation in the Americas 10 times over. Now, the accepted date of original human habitation today has already been pushed back 10, maybe even 15 or 20,000 years before the Clovis first date. This is still like 5 times older than that. This is way too old. What's even more significant is that the accepted dates for human modern Homo sapien migration out of Africa is less than 130,000 years. So if this is a human mastodon butcher site, one of 2 things is happening. Either modern humans left Africa way earlier than we thought they did, or this is a different species of hominid. And as far as I'm aware, we have no other evidence of a non-modern human species of hominid anywhere in the Americas. This would be the first, if it is true. So they got those dates, and they tested them 5 times over. I don't know if they actually tested them 5 times. They tested them a lot. They used multiple different dating methods from multiple different areas of the site. And they all came up with approximately the same number of 130,000 years. So when this hit the presses, even the most ardent, strict hardline Clovis firsters, like C. Vance Haynes, didn't try to argue with the dates, because they were so well tested that it was inarguable. But they argued with everything else. As far as what I think, there is one important detail that Miniminuteman, I don't think he talks about it in his video. The majority of the archaeological community, the vast majority, and I've gotten this from personal communication with some archaeologists I know, the vast majority of the archaeological community does not find merit in a hominin presence at the Cerutti Mastodon site 130,000 years ago. There is controversy over the nature of the fractures of the bones. Now, everything about this site, the problem with a site like this is that everything could be recreated through natural processes. There's nothing here that is unequivocally of human origin. We don't have human bones, we don't have human feces, we don't have unequivocal tools like spear points or anything like that. And the problem with a lot of early proposed sites is that the evidence is of this nature, where it could be man-made. It could also, with near equal possibility, or at least a high degree of probability, have been natural in creation. There are some weird things about this site that don't look natural, but just because it has a low chance of being done naturally doesn't mean that it wasn't. Now, sites with evidence like this aren't condemned to the oblivion of, well, we just can't tell. I talked about in my land bridge video, some sites like Bluefish Caves had evidence of this sort, where for the longest time it was thought that this could very well have been recreated through natural processes, and it doesn't look good enough to say that it was human. It has been reanalyzed and pretty conclusively demonstrated to be of human origin. So just because there are no human bones or spear points or anything at the Cerutti site doesn't mean humans weren't there, doesn't mean we can't show that humans were there. There is a bit of a controversy with the bone fractures, though. Most of the bones are spiral fractures. Now, spiral fractures occur very commonly naturally. I mean, we have spiral fractures on dinosaur bones, and people clearly were not involved in that. So the fractures could very easily have been done naturally. There's another part of it, though, and that is whether the fractures are perimortem or postmortem. What does this mean? For those of you who are not familiar, the chemical composition of a bone changes over the lifespan of the bone, and especially relative to when the animal died. And those changes in the chemical composition affect the way the bone breaks in detectable ways. If it broke before an animal died, an antemortem fracture, it's going to have a certain breakage pattern, and it's almost certainly going to show signs of healing. If it broke close to or shortly after the time of death, it's going to have certain breakage patterns. Obviously, it's no longer going to be showing signs of healing. And then if it broke a long time after the time of death, it's going to show another classification of breakage patterns. Shortly after time of death, the bone is still wet, and this is going to produce a perimortem fracture. Over time, that bone dries out, and that drying changes the nature of the bone, and fractures at that point produce a postmortem fracture, and the difference is detectable. How long it takes for that bone to dry out and transition from a perimortem to a postmortem fracture is going to change depending on lots of different conditions. The boundary between peri and postmortem could be a couple days after death, it could be up to 5 months after death, but it's going to be within the first couple months of the animal dying. Definitely not even up to a year. So if we have perimortem fractures, we know that these fractures occurred within a couple months of the animal dying. The problem is if we have postmortem fractures, we have no idea of knowing how many years after the animal died that occurred. It could have occurred 6 months after the animal died. It could have occurred 10,000 years after the animal died. Unless the bone fossilizes and turns to stone, at which point it's going to have even different breakage patterns, bones can last quite a long time without fossilizing. So if we have postmortem fractures, it could have been caused by humans 130,000 years ago. It could have been caused by humans 1,000 years ago. There's no way of dating when a postmortem fracture happened. And there's debate over whether the fractures at the Cerutti site are perimortem or postmortem. And that has pretty big implications as to whether or not we're calling this a 130,000-year-old hominin butcher site. If they're post-mortem, and they occurred, 130,000 years ago, just a year after the Mastodon died, people could have been there, but they almost certainly weren't butchering it. Because by the time the bone transitions to a post-mortem fracture, all that is edible on the body is spoiled, and pretty much all the other usable stuff of that animal is decayed or eaten or in other ways not useful. At butcher sites, we see a high degree of perimortem fractures. We see a very low degree of postmortem fractures at butcher sites. So if these are postmortem fractures, it could have been done by people 130,000 years ago, but in which case they weren't butchering the animal and it's not a kill site. Or it could have been by people 5,000 years ago. It could have been by natural processes at any point in between. There's no way of knowing. So that uncertainty over whether these are peri or postmortem fractures is throwing a lot of uncertainty over the whole validity of the hominin presence at the Cerutti site. Now, I did say that most archaeologists are very skeptical that this is a hominin presence. There is a very valid criticism, and I've done 2 whole videos on this, so I'm not going to go a whole lot into detail. You can watch those. There is a very valid criticism that there is a strong unobjective bias in the field of American archaeology against old dates. I mean, still to this day, every time a new site is published which pushes the earliest habitation back just 500 years, it gets viciously crucified and sent through the ringer. Like, there is something to be said about American archaeology having a serious problem, an unscientific level of serious problem with old dates. But that doesn't mean that every American archaeologist is hopelessly unobjective and biased against old dates. Like, there are plenty of good professional archaeologists who have published old dates, like J.M. Adovazio, the excavator of Meadowcroft, or Tom Delahaye, the excavator of Monteverde, who have legitimate skepticism about the Cerutti site. So when looking at old dates, when looking at the Cerutti site, it's right to keep a chip on your shoulder and remember that American archaeology has just a problem with old dates, but that doesn't mean that nobody can have legitimate criticisms of the site. I don't know if the question on Cerutti is ever going to be settled, one way or the other. I can say it gets debated a lot more in the public than it does in academia. Most archaeologists would consider it not a hominin site and just leave it at that. I think if we wanted to really try to dig deeper, what you could do is look at other sites at this 130,000 year time frame and see if you can see similar things. And maybe from the results of those other sites, you can glean some info in how to interpret Cerutti. Like, maybe there's more evidence of human presence at other sites 130,000 years ago, or maybe there are similar conditions that give us a better idea of how the natural processes occurred at Cerutti. Maybe that's not a satisfying answer, but it's a possible line of further investigation. I think we've probably gathered all the data we can from Cerutti, and at this point we're just going to be arguing back and forth on pre-established facts, so it might be a good idea to try looking at other sites. Alright, that was it for this video. Thank you all very much for watching. Again, if you want me to answer any questions you have about Indigenous American history and cultures and languages, leave a comment and we'll get to those in future videos. This has been Indigenous History Now. Do like, subscribe, hit that notification button, all those things that help us out in the algorithm. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you later.